Welcome to Fresh Catholic Teaching Courses. This is series number 6, and this is our Lenten series. And we here at Fresh Catholic figured we'd take a little different perspective on the Lenten series, in that what we decided to do is go back to the original Holy Week in 33 AD and journey through it day by day, learning what happened on each of those days in the original Holy Week. And our thinking is that way, when we celebrate Holy Week this year, as we go through each day of Holy Week, we'll be able to kind of reflect on and meditate on and enter into each of these days, because we'll know what happened on them during the original days of the original Holy Week. So that's kind of the perspective, that's kind of the angle we're taking. Hopefully you're enjoying it. So far, we've done an episode on Palm Sunday. We've done an episode on what we call Cleansing Monday, because that was the day Jesus cleanses the temple. We did an episode on what we call Teaching Tuesday, because that's the day Jesus is teaching in the temple and gets peppered with all kinds of questions. And our last episode, we did what was called Spy Wednesday, where we did one of those split screen deals, so to speak. And on one screen, we had Jesus back in the temple area teaching, while on the other screen, we had Judas meeting with the Jewish religious leaders, cutting his deal to betray Jesus. So those are the previous episodes and the previous days. As we enter this episode, it's going to be Thursday morning, what we call Holy Thursday. And when we look at Holy Thursday, I'm going to highlight 6 different things that happened on Holy Thursday of the original Holy Week. Now, because we're talking 6 different things, and because each of those things very significant, what we're going to do, as I mentioned at the beginning of this series, is we're going to take Holy Thursday and spread it out over 2 episodes. So this episode we'll call Holy Thursday Part 1, where we're going to do 5 of those 6 things. And the next episode we'll call Holy Thursday Part 2, where we'll do the final thing. That'll get us through Holy Thursday, the next 2 episodes. Then in like fashion, we're going to spread Good Friday out into 2 episodes, which we'll call Good Friday Part 1 and Good Friday Part 2. And then we'll wrap up our series with a quick look at Holy Thursday, and then we'll consider Easter Sunday. So that's kind of how the series has progressed so far. That's what we have to look forward to. 2 episodes on Holy Thursday, 2 episodes on Good Friday, and then a final episode on Holy Thursday and Easter Sunday. So with that said, what are the 6 events we're going to look at for Holy Thursday? The first 5 of which will cover this episode. Well, the first thing we'll consider, as was the case each morning of Holy Week, Jesus and his disciples are going to leave Bethany, where they've been spending the evenings at the house of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, and they're going to journey into Jerusalem. So the first event we're going to look at for Holy Thursday is the journey back into Jerusalem from Bethany. Second event is the preparation for the Passover. The third event will be the Passover meal or the Last Supper. The fourth event will be the agony in the garden. And the 5th and final event we'll do this episode, the arrest in the garden. Now, next episode, when we finish Holy Thursday, we'll do that 6th and final event, and that is the 3 so-called Jewish trials Jesus has put through. So those are the 6 events we're going to cover Holy Thursday. The first 5 this episode, the final 1 next episode. So with all of that as background, again, let's kind of transport ourselves back in time, so to speak. It's 33 AD. It's the original Holy Week, and it's Thursday morning. And as every morning since we began this Holy Week, Jesus and the disciples, they spent the night at the home of Martha, Mary, and Lazarus at Bethany. They are going to travel back into Jerusalem. However, each of the previous days, when they got up and traveled into Jerusalem, when that day ended, they went back to Bethany and spent the night. This time they won't. When Jesus and his disciples leave Bethany on Thursday morning, they will not return to Bethany, because on Thursday night, Jesus is going to be arrested. The disciples are going to scatter. So as they leave Bethany on this Thursday morning to go back into Jerusalem, as was their pattern each day of Holy Week, the one change is this time they won't be going back to Bethany. They are leaving Bethany for the last time. And consider that. As they leave Bethany and travel the same route they've traveled Sunday morning, Monday morning, Tuesday morning, Wednesday morning, as they travel that same route from Bethany to Jerusalem, they're going to pass that fig tree that Jesus cursed and that has withered, which he did on Monday, right? They're going to take that same main road into Jerusalem, except this day it won't be lined with cheering and adoring crowds, okay? And Jesus is going to go into the temple area, the same temple that he had cleansed back on Monday. So that's the journey from Bethany into Jerusalem for the final time. Now, before they start that journey, Jesus asked two of his disciples to go into the city to prepare for the Passover. So, let me go ahead and let me read, both Matthew, Mark, and Luke record this preparation for the Passover, but let me read you Mark's account because it indicates two items that we want to kind of highlight here. So this is coming from Mark chapter 14 and picking up on verse 12. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" He sent two of his disciples and said to them, let me hit the pause button. So, event number one we said we would talk about is the journey, the last journey from Bethany into Jerusalem. Second event we said we would talk about is the preparation for the Passover. I just read for you Mark's recording of that preparation. Jesus takes two of his disciples, tells them to go into the city. Now, Mark mentions two details. He starts out, he says, on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb. Now, you might be saying, well, Charles, wait a second, I'm kind of confused here. Mark indicates this is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I thought this was the Feast of the Passover that was being celebrated. And the answer to that is yes and no. Because the deal is that Passover was the first day of a larger feast called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, the Feast of Unleavened Bread was an 8-day feast. The first day of those 8 days was the Passover. So people think about, the Feast of the Passover, and yes, it's the Feast of the Passover, but the Passover was part of a larger feast called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So Mark doesn't have it wrong, obviously, okay? It is the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, the first day of which they celebrate the Passover. And like I mentioned, interestingly enough, because, we can trace Catholicism. Catholicism has its roots in ancient Judaism. In the Christmas, there's Christmas Day, and then there's what's called the octave of Christmas, which is 8 days. There's Easter Day, and then there's the octave of Easter, which is 8 days. So these feast days on the Jewish calendar, and specifically the feast we're looking at here, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, this feast was 8 days long. That's where we get the 8-day octave that we are in the first 8 days after Christmas Day and the first 8 days from Easter Sunday. Because again, Catholicism finds its roots in ancient Judaism. So when Mark says it's the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that's what he's talking about. Now, the other detail Mark records is he says Jesus sent two of his disciples to start making preparations for the Passover. And if you're like me, and I'm an academic, I research, I teach, I write, right? So I tend to be inquisitive by nature. I see that and I go, oh man, Mark, I wish you would have told me which two disciples he sent. Not that it mattered, but it would be nice to know. Well, Mark doesn't tell us which two disciples, but if we go to another one of the Gospels, we can find out who they were. In fact, if we consult Luke's Gospel, specifically Luke chapter 28, verse 8, we find out who these two disciples are. And we're not surprised when we hear their names. The two disciples, Mark tells us that Jesus told to go into the city and make preparations for the Passover. Those two disciples are Peter and John. Now, why do I say that we shouldn't be surprised when we find out those are the two? Because remember, Jesus, 12 disciples, right? And 3 of them were kind of the inner circle. Peter, James, and John. Those are the 3 he took up onto the Mount of Transfiguration. Those are the 3 that went further into the Garden of Gethsemane with him. So Peter, James, and John have always been kind of the inner circle, the inner 3 of the 12. So when Luke tells us these 2 disciples Jesus sent into the city to make preparations for the Passover, when Mark tells us their names were Peter and John, that's 2 of the inner 3. So we really shouldn't be surprised. So, Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first day of which is the Passover, and the 2 disciples that make these preparations, Peter and John. Okay? Now, let me read you the rest of Mark's recording of this event. Because not only does Jesus tell these 2 disciples, go into the city and make preparation for the Passover, he gives them very specific details on how this is going to play out. So let's pick up Mark's recording, okay? He says, on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, where do you want us to go to prepare the Passover? He sent 2 of his disciples, which we now know are Peter and John. He sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, now look at the specifics Jesus gives them. He says, go into the city, number 1, and a man will meet you carrying a water jar. Number 2, wherever he enters, say to the master of the house. Number 3, the teacher says, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Then he will show you a large upper room furnished and ready. Number 4, make the preparations there. So in this second event that we're going to highlight of Holy Thursday, first event was going from Bethany to Jerusalem. The second event is preparations for the Passover. Look at how Mark records the details. Jesus is basically telling his disciples, look, okay, Peter and John, go into the city. When you arrive in the city, you're going to see a man carrying a water jar. Follow that man. He's going to lead you to a house. The owner of the house is going to be there. And when you get to this house, tell the owner, where is the guest room where we're going to eat the Passover? The owner will then take you to a large upper room furnished and ready. So he basically tells Peter and John exactly how this is going to play out. Now, if we continue reading the narrative, we're not surprised that it plays out exactly that way. Peter and John do go into the city. When they arrive there, they do see a man carrying a water jar. They follow that man. He, in fact, leads them to a house. The owner of that house is outside. And they tell the owner what Jesus told them to tell him. Where is the guest room? And sure enough, the owner leads them to a large upper room, furnished and ready, and that's where they make the preparations. So Jesus tells them, this is how it's going to play out, and it plays out that exact way. Now, why do I mention this? Well, we've seen this kind of situation before, haven't we? Remember earlier in Holy Week, before Jesus is making his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Remember, Jesus kind of indicates to his disciples how something is going to play out? Are you tracking with me here? Remember, Jesus said, go into the village next to us. Okay, there's going to be a donkey tied up. untie the donkey. The owner's going to say, what's going on? And tell the owner that the master has need of it and will return it. Remember how Jesus told them in advance how that was going to play out? And it played out the exact same way. Same situation here. Okay? Now we fast forward to Holy Thursday morning. Jesus tells them again how a situation is going to play out, and it plays out that same way. And we're no more surprised now than we were surprised with the donkey, because Jesus is God. He knows how things are going to play out. So that's why. So when we talk about preparations for the Passover, that's why I bring that out. This is the second time this week where we've seen Jesus tell his disciples in advance how something's going to play out, and it plays out that exact way. Couple of more items that I'd like to bring out before we move off of this event into the next event we're going to highlight. And it's that man carrying that water jar, right? Because remember, Jesus said, as soon as you hit the city, okay, and there's going to be all kinds of people walking all different ways, right? Scan the crowd, and there's going to be a man carrying a water jar. That's the guy you follow, okay? So they get there, and obviously they're scanning the crowd, and sure enough, here's a man carrying a water jar. Now you might say, Charles, what's such a big deal about the man carrying a water jar? Well, again, this is first century, right? Men did not carry water jars. That was a woman's job, okay? The woman was tasked every day to go down and get enough water for the household to conduct its business that day, to wash its clothes, to cook its food, to clean its utensils. So women were the one that carried water jars to and from their homes. Men didn't do that. So the fact that there's going to be a man carrying a water jar, that would have been very, very unusual. And, not by coincidence, very easy to spot as well. Okay? So, that's the preparations for the Passover. Now we move to event number 3 that we're going to take a look at, and we're going to take a look at the Passover meal itself, the Last Supper. Okay? Now, there's been kind of some debate among some people about whether the Last Supper was actually a Passover meal. Some people debate that. And because within the Last Supper, as we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, Jesus, in that upper room, during this Last Supper, during this Passover meal, is going to institute 2 of the 7 sacraments. He's going to institute the sacrament of the Eucharist, which most of us probably already know. But he's also going to institute the sacrament of holy orders, the sacrament of the priesthood. And he's going to institute these 2 sacraments, yes, during the Last Supper, but he's going to institute them within a Passover meal. And that's significant because the Passover meal commemorated the original exodus of the Israelites out from underneath the oppression and bondage of Pharaoh and Egypt. So the Passover, the original Passover, commemorated the original Exodus. Now in theology, we say that Jesus is going to lead a new Exodus, where he's going to lead his people not from the bondage of Pharaoh and Egypt, not even from the bondage of Caesar and Rome, but from the bondage and oppression of Satan and sin. So Jesus is going to lead this new Exodus. So in having the Last Supper and instituting the Eucharist and the priesthood within the confines of a Passover meal, that makes perfect sense because the original Passover looked back to the original Exodus. This Passover meal, this Last Supper, will begin the new Exodus. So theologically, it's eminently fitting and proper that the Last Supper is a Passover meal. So theologically, it makes sense. But even beyond that, Notice, and this is another reason why I kind of picked out Mark's recording here. Notice, Jesus calls it a Passover meal. So if you say, well, yeah, Charles, theologically it makes sense, but that's theologically. What does Jesus have to say? Well, what does Jesus have to say? He says that this supper they're going to eat, his last supper with his disciples, hence the Last Supper, is a Passover meal. Let's go back to Jesus' words. He says, when he enters, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? So this Last Supper Jesus is going to have on Holy Thursday night in the upper room is a Passover meal. Theologically, it makes sense, and Jesus' very words confirm that fact. So, this was, in fact, a Passover meal, and the only reason I mention that is because, among some circles, it's debated, was this an actual Passover meal or not? And the conclusion is, it is. Now, it's also called a Seder meal. And people say, Seder, why is it called a Seder meal? Well, the word Seder means order. And in a Passover meal, you ate the food, you ate the various dishes, you ate the various courses in a very specific prescribed order. Okay, so since you ate the meal in a prescribed orderly fashion, and since Seder means order, that's why it's characterized as a Seder meal. Now, let's go ahead, and as we're back in time, right? Let's go ahead and enter. Oh, by the way, another detail which is interesting, and you get the idea why we're splitting Holy Thursday into 2 episodes, because there's a lot here. This notion of this room they ate this Passover meal in, it's always been called the upper room. And people sometimes say, well, why do they call it that? Or was it in fact an upper room? Again, Jesus himself characterizes it as an upper room. Another reason why we're looking at this recording out of Mark's gospel. Again, let's go back to his recording. Okay? When he enters, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where is the guest room where I may eat my Passover, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Then he will show you a large upper room. So the fact that this is a Passover meal, Jesus' very words confirm it. The fact that they did eat it in an upper room, Jesus' very words confirm it. So this was a Passover meal. It was eaten in a large upper room. Now let's enter that upper room and kind of survey the scene. All right? When we enter the upper room, now again, this is first century. People didn't eat with tables and chairs. Okay? What we would see is there would be like a U-shaped, there'd be tables set up, no legs, they'd be on the ground in the U shape. And the people would kind of fan out on the outside of this U. And they would lie down on their left side. Their head would be at the table. Their feet would be sticking out at the other end, the other side. So they lay down on their left side. Okay, they kind of prop themselves up on like a pillow or a cushion on their left side, and they would eat the food with their right hand. That's why, if you read in scriptures, whenever there's a scene recorded where people are eating, the phraseology that's used is they reclined at table. And they actually did recline, because they would recline on their left side, propped up by their left elbow, and they'd eat the food with their right hand. So people ate laying down on their left side. They ate in a reclining fashion. Not quite sure how good that was for digestive purposes, but that's the way they ate. So when we enter this upper room, that's where we wouldn't see a banquet table. A lot of times, we take a look and we base our visual of what this scene looked like by the way Da Vinci kind of characterized it in his painting of the Last Supper, when in fact they would be on their sides, on the ground, reclining, and then eating with the right hand. So that's what we would see, okay? Now, within the confines of this Passover meal, Jesus, as we said, would institute the sacrament of the Eucharist and the sacrament of holy orders. Now, the question is, okay, as the Passover meal kind of played out, where in the Passover meal does Jesus institute the sacrament of the Eucharist and the sacrament of holy orders, the priesthood, okay? Well, if we go back to how the Passover was celebrated back in the day, okay, let's take the Eucharist first and then let's take holy orders after that. In the first century, if you were a devout Jewish person and it came time to celebrate the Passover and it came time to have the Passover meal, okay, the host of that Passover meal, which would be, the man, the father, the husband, okay, there would be a point in that Passover meal where the host would take bread and he would say words to the effect, "This is the bread of affliction, which our forefathers ate when they were afflicted in the desert." So at a certain point in the Passover meal, that's what the host would do. He would take bread and he would say, "This is the bread of affliction, which our forefathers ate when they were afflicted in the desert." Now we know there's a point in the Passover meal and the Last Supper where the host, Jesus, takes bread. And he doesn't say, "This is the bread of the affliction." What he does say, as we know, is, "Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body, which will be given up for you." So, there's a point in the Passover meal when it's celebrated, the host takes bread, calls it the bread of affliction. There's a point in the Last Supper where Jesus takes bread and says, "This is my body." Okay? So you've got bread and you've got bread. In the original Passover celebration, okay, it was the bread of affliction, and we know that Jesus is going to be afflicted because he's going to undergo his passion and death. So the thinking has always been that's the point in the Passover meal that Jesus institutes the Eucharist, the bread to his body part, okay? Now, how about the wine? Well, again, there's a certain point in the celebration of the Passover meal where, again, the host takes a cup of wine and says words to this effect, "This is the wine of remembrance of what God did for our forefathers in Egypt." So you've got the host taking a cup of wine, calling it the cup of remembrance. Now we know in the Last Supper, Passover meal, there's a point where Jesus takes a cup of wine, right? And he says, as we know, "Take this, all of you, and drink from it, for this is the chalice of my blood, the blood of the new and eternal covenant, which will be poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins." So again, notice the parallel. Host takes a cup of wine, Jesus takes a cup of wine. But Jesus doesn't say this is the cup of remembrance. This is where Jesus institutes the wine to precious blood part of the Eucharist. So we can see that the Last Supper, being a Passover meal, Jesus institutes the Eucharist, the bread to his body, the wine to his precious blood, at the points in the Passover meal where the host would take the bread of affliction and the cup of remembrance. So that's where the Eucharist, within this Passover meal, that's where the Eucharist is instituted. Okay? Now, how about the priesthood? Because you're saying, okay, I know that Jesus instituted the Eucharist during the Last Supper, but he instituted the sacrament of holy orders, the New Testament priesthood. He instituted that during the Last Supper, the Passover meal. Yes, he did, and there's two events in this upper room that point to that. Now, the first one, okay, when Jesus says, "This is my body," and when Jesus says, "This is the chalice of my blood," okay, he after he says those things, he tells his disciples, Do this in memory of me. Do this. And what is the this Jesus is doing in that upper room? He's turning the bread into his body and the wine into his blood. So he's telling his disciples, do this same thing. Okay? Offer the sacrifice that is starting in the upper room that will be completed the next day on the cross. Okay? Make present this sacrifice. Now, in the Old Testament, the only individuals that could offer sacrifices were the Old Testament priests. You had to be a priest to offer sacrifice. So when Jesus indicates to his disciples, do this, which is make present the sacrifice that's starting here and that'll be completed on Calvary. When Jesus says, do this, the only way they could do this is if they were priests. So when Jesus says the words, do this, that's when the New Testament priesthood starts. That's where the disciples would become priests. And of course, the disciples would go on to be apostles, and the bishops come from the direct line of the apostles. And bishops ordain priests. So the sacrament of holy orders, the New Testament priesthood, started right here, as did the Eucharist, in the upper room during this Last Supper Passover meal, when Jesus says, do this. Because the only ones that could do this, offer the sacrifice, make it present, would be priests. The other event in this upper room that points to the institution of holy orders at this point in time is, you remember that Jesus washed the disciples' feet. And, rightly so, that's always been, symbolized the significance of, discipleship being servanthood. All right? But there's another element to that often gets overlooked or not really understood, and that's the priesthood element. The foot washing ritual had a priesthood element to it, because if we go back to the Old Testament, okay, when individuals became priests, when they went through the ritual of becoming an Old Testament priest, one part of that ritual was a foot washing. And in fact, if we read a little bit more closely in the Old Testament, we'll find that God told Moses to wash his hands and his feet before he entered the tabernacle. And we learn that Aaron and his sons had to wash their hands and feet before they entered the tabernacle. Okay? So this foot washing, okay, was part of the Old Testament ritual of becoming a priest. So when Jesus washes the disciples' feet, yes, it signifies the type of discipleship that they and we are to engage in, servanthood, but it also indicates priesthood, because it was part of the Old Testament priesthood ritual, foot washing. So the do this and the foot washing point to the fact that the sacrament of holy orders was also instituted in this upper room on Holy Thursday night, as was the Eucharist. Okay? Very, very interesting. Now, let me kind of, before we move out of this upper room, okay, let me just, and again, as deep of a dive as we do in these series, and hopefully you agree it's a deep dive, it's not exhaustive, So let me just point out 6 parallels between the original Passover lamb and, of course, Jesus being the Lamb of God. Because there's a reason why Jesus is called the Lamb of God, right? So consider these parallels, all right? The Passover lamb had to be 1 year old. Now, in lamb speak, a 1-year-old lamb was in the prime of its life. Jesus was 33 years old, and he was in the prime of his life. That's one parallel. Staying with the lamb now. Second, the lamb had to be a male. Jesus was a male. Third parallel, still staying with the lamb had to be unblemished. All right? No defects, nothing wrong with it. Unblemished. Jesus was unblemished. He was sinless. So 3 aspects of the Passover lamb that Jesus fulfills. Prime of life, male, unblemished. All right? Now, the Passover lamb had to be selected by the father of the house. The Heavenly Father ordained from all eternity that his Son was going to be the lamb. Okay? Another parallel. Once the Passover lamb was selected, it had to be inspected for 4 days to make sure it was unblemished. There were no defects. So the Passover lamb, once selected, had to be inspected for 4 days before it was sacrificed. Jesus was inspected for 4 days before he was sacrificed, okay? Because we know that he was peppered with questions by the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the scribes and the Herodians on Teaching Tuesday. He was also put through 3 Jewish trials where he was interrogated. He was put through 3 Roman trials where he was inspected or interrogated, right? And all of that happened before he went through his sacrifice on Good Friday. So the Passover lamb had to go through a period of inspection. Jesus went through his period of inspection as the Lamb of God. The parallels continue, okay? Let's see. The Passover lamb had to be sacrificed, but none of its bones could be broken. And we know none of Jesus's bones were broken. Because when the 2 thieves, and we know the story, when the 2 thieves, their bones were broken, which hastened their death. When they came to Jesus, they realized he was already dead, so they didn't break his bones. Another parallel. Another parallel, original Exodus, right? The Passover, the Israelites had to put the blood of the lamb on their wooden doorposts. Jesus shed his blood on a wooden cross. And final parallel, among many others, I'm just bringing up 6 or 7 of them. Original Passover, the lamb had to be sacrificed at twilight. Now the word twilight means between the evenings. That's what twilight means, between the evenings. So the original Passover lamb sacrificed between the evenings at twilight. Jesus was also sacrificed. He died at twilight. He died between the evenings. Now, if you're saying, wait a second, Charles, he died at 3 in the afternoon. How can we say he died between the evenings? Here's how. He dies at 3 in the afternoon. We know from 12 to 3 there was darkness, total darkness. So from 12 to 3 there was darkness. All right? 6 o'clock on that night. 6 o'clock was when sunset happened. From 6 o'clock on that night, there was darkness. So 12 to 3, there's darkness. The darkness ends at 3. That darkness ends at 3. The darkness of that night starts at 6. Jesus dies at 3. He dies between the evenings, between the darkness of the 12 through 3 and then the darkness of Friday night. So again, not exhaustive, but all these parallels on how Jesus is the Lamb of God who fulfills the original Passover lamb. So I thought I'd put that in there. So now, again, not exhaustive, but now let's leave the upper room and let's head to the Mount of Olives. So Jesus and his disciples leave the upper room. They go down to the Kidron Valley. They cross the Kidron Valley and they go up to the Mount of Olives and into a garden called the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, the Mount of Olives is called the Mount of Olives because it had olive trees all over it. So, Mount of Olives. And in the Mount of Olives, there was a garden. And the garden we know is called Gethsemane. Now, Gethsemane, the word Gethsemane means oil press. And in this garden, in that garden on that Mount of Olives, in the middle of that garden was an oil press. And that makes sense because if there's olive trees all over this mountain, okay, what they would do is they would take the olives, they would bring them to this oil press in this garden, right? And they would press the olives down, and that's how they would get the olive oil. So it's called it's called the Mount of Olives because there were olive trees on it. It's called the Garden of Gethsemane because it was a garden, and in that garden was an oil press, and Gethsemane means oil press. So they leave the upper room, go down through the Kidron Valley, go up the Mount of Olives, go into this garden, right? And we know that Jesus, the next event we'll highlight here for our purposes, Jesus undergoes his agony in the garden. Two things about this event, and again, it's not exhaustive, to stay within the scope of our podcast. Two events I will mention is we know that at a point in time in his agony, he sweats blood. Now, this is an actual condition, and I'm hoping I pronounce it right because I've looked this up and I've heard a couple of different pronunciations. Hematidrosis. There's a condition called hematidrosis. It's very rare, where individuals who are undergoing extreme stress and agony, which Jesus was, obviously, people that are undergoing that degree of stress and anxiety and agony can, on rare occasions, sweat blood. And the way this happens is, not to turn this into a medical podcast, but there's capillaries. And what happens is the extreme stress and the anxiety and the agony, okay, the capillaries near the sweat glands, the capillaries would kind of excrete blood, and the blood would come out through the sweat glands. So so Jesus sweating blood, people say, well, is that kind of hyperbole? Was it over-dramatization to underscore the degree of agony he went through? No, it's an actual condition. People can, in fact, sweat blood. The condition is called, and again, hematidrosis. I'm trying to pronounce that correctly. It's very rare, and it happens to people undergoing extreme periods of stress and agony, which Jesus was. So he actually did sweat blood. The other aspect of the agony that I think we can point out within the confines of our podcast time is that we know that Jesus goes and prays, right? And a couple of times comes out, finds the disciples sleeping, right? And then the final time, one of the final times he says, "Cannot you stay and watch with me for 1 hour?" And it's always been the thinking that that's where the Catholic Church gets the spending an hour in adoration in front of the Blessed Sacrament. Coming in front of the Blessed Sacrament and watching for an hour goes back to Jesus kind of rebuking his disciples for not being able to do that, because it is mentioned, cannot you watch with me for 1 hour? That's where the Catholic holy hour comes from, in front of the Blessed Sacrament. So those are the two parts we'll talk about as far as his agony is concerned. Now next we'll move to his arrest. All right. Now again, we know the narrative. There's a point where Judas arrives with what we're told is a band of individuals, soldiers and guards, or sometimes they're referred to as soldiers or officials. As far as making up this band of individuals Judas arrives in the garden to arrest Jesus with. Well, the soldiers were Roman soldiers. The guards or officials were the temple guards, or the temple officials that guarded the temple. Why is that significant? Because again, the very people that Jesus came to save, Jews and Gentiles, they are involved, so to speak, in his arrest and his passion and his death. The Roman soldiers, those are the Gentiles. The temple guards or temple police, temple officials, those are the Jewish. So Jews and Gentiles are involved in his arrest, his passion and death, the very same people, so to speak, that he came to save. Kind of interesting. So that's who the band of people were. Now they arrive with all kinds of torches and lanterns, we know, right? Well, what's the deal with that? Well, again, this is first century. This is on a mountain, it's in a garden, it is pitch black. You didn't have any street lights, nobody had flashlights, nobody had cell phones they could turn on the flashlight with, right? It was pitch dark, all right? There were no cameras, no social media, there weren't pictures of Jesus floating around Jerusalem. So the thinking has always been that since it's pitch dark, and since some of these people, other than Judas, might not have ever seen Jesus before, they might not know what he looks like, they needed these torches and lanterns to safely get to that spot and to be able to see all the faces, right? That's also why Judas agreed with them back on Spy Wednesday that I'm going to point him out by kissing him. A further thing that tells us they probably didn't know which of the people in that garden were Jesus, okay? Hence the torches and the lanterns to get there, to see the faces, to see who Judas goes up to and kisses. That's how they know which one is Jesus. And let's mention that kiss a little bit, all right? Because think about it. Judas, back on Spy Wednesday, indicated to the Jewish religious leaders when he was cutting his deal, don't worry, I know where he'll be, I can lead you to him, and I can point him out to you. I've covered all the bases. You don't have to worry about anything. Well, that brings up the question, how did Judas know that Jesus and the disciples would be on the Mount of Olives, specifically in the Garden of Gethsemane? Well, the Gospels tell us that that's a place that they had been to before. It was a garden. It was quiet. It was remote. They'd been there before to rest, to spend the night, to pray. So this is a place that Jesus and his disciples had frequented before. That's how Judas knew where he would be, okay? Now, the other question is, why did Judas, because think about it again, Judas could have pointed Jesus out any number of ways, couldn't he? He could have just pointed to him and said, that's him, arrest him. He could have gone up and patted him on the shoulder and said, this is the guy, okay? He could have grabbed Jesus and brought him over, okay? Any number of ways he could have pointed him out. But of all those ways, Judas selects to kiss him. And the kiss is one of those kisses on each side of the cheek, which back then, and still is in some cultures today, reserved for family members and only the closest of friends. So of all the ways Judas can pick to point Jesus out, he picks the kiss where you would give only your family members and closest friends. And that gives us a peek into gives us a window into Judas's heart and how much disdain and how much disdain he's built up for Jesus and how much he despises him, to use that gesture as a way to point out his arrest. Okay, so I figured I'd mention that out. Now, I mentioned the kiss that Judas gave Jesus reserved for just family members and friends. Notice what Jesus says. Jesus, after Judas does this, Jesus says, friend, you betray me with a kiss. So Jesus even calls Judas friend, because he just kissed him with the kiss that you reserve for family members or closest friends. One other thing I should point out, and again, I don't know if necessarily that it's within the scope of these podcasts, these episodes, but there are several points along the way, from here to when Jesus goes to the cross, from Holy Thursday night to Good Friday, where Jesus gives Judas several opportunities to kind of step back, to step away from the path he's on, to repent, okay? Scholars, theologians have always recognized this as one of them, because when Jesus calls Judas friend, that's kind of one opportunity Jesus is, in essence, is saying, look, Judas, it's not too late. You can back away from this. You don't have to go through with it, all right? You're still my friend. And of course, we know that these various points where Jesus gives Judas opportunities to back away and repent, sadly, Judas doesn't do that. So that's, that's the rest in the garden. Those are who the people were. That's why they brought torches and lanterns. We talked about Judas selecting a kiss to betray Jesus. And then we'll wrap up this episode of Holy Thursday Part 1 by mentioning one other part of this arrest. And we know that once the soldiers get there, once Judas points Jesus out, right? Notice the things he doesn't do. He doesn't run away. He doesn't fight back. In fact, he rebukes Peter for fighting back. Because remember, Peter drew his sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant, whose name was Malchus. So not only did Jesus not run away, not only did Jesus not fight back, he scolded Peter for doing that same thing, trying to fight back. All right? He didn't say, look, you got the wrong guy. He didn't say, I'm not your man. He didn't deny it, right? He stepped forward. All right? Even when people say, even when, Jesus said, who are you looking for? All right? Jesus said, I'm he. So Jesus voluntarily allowed himself to be arrested. And that voluntariness is critical because there are several things that make his sacrifice redemptive. There are several things that give it its redemptive value. A number of things. One of them is the voluntariness of it. So the fact that he went through his arrest, he went through his passion, he went through his death voluntarily, that voluntariness, if that's even a word, that is one of the things that gives his sacrifice its redemptive value, among many other things. So I want to point that out as well. One more thing, and I'm looking at the monitor and it's like 54 minutes, so I'll quickly wrap up. And that is going back to Peter drawing that sword and swinging it and cutting off the high priest's servant's ear, we know his name is Malchus. Think about it. The sword he drew was a big long sword. It wasn't one of these rapier type swords. It was a big long sword, right? So Peter would have to be one heck of a swordsman to take a sword out, swing it, and just cut off a man's ear. That would involve a lot of skill as a swordsman, just to cut off the ear using a sword of that nature. Well, Peter's a fisherman. He's not a professional swordsman. So the thinking among scholars and theologians has always been that in swinging that sword, Peter wasn't aiming for the ear. He was aiming to cut off his head and missed and hit his ear. So I figured I'd mention that. And since I've got you here, one more thing, okay? What happens to that ear? We know Jesus picks it up and puts it back on Malchus's head and heals him, right? A lot of times people miss the fact that Jesus just performed a miracle here. he healed a man's severed ear. So there was a miracle performed in this garden on this Holy Thursday night during Jesus' arrest that sometimes kind of gets passed over. And I know I've said one last thing a couple of times. I promise this is the last thing. That's why I'm so much of a scripture geek. And that is, we know we're talking about this episode and next episode, we're talking about Holy Thursday, right? Well, back in the day, if you're of an age, this was originally called Maundy Thursday. M-A-U-N-D-Y, Maundy Thursday. It's hence been referred to as Holy Thursday, but originally it was called Maundy Thursday. People say Maundy. First of all, I've never heard of that word. And what does it mean? It sounds kind of like Maundy. It sounds kind of morose. Okay? Is it called Maundy because it's morose, because Jesus went through his agony and he was arrested? No, Maundy doesn't mean morose, even though it kind of has that sound. Maundy comes from the word mandatum. And mandatum means commandment. Now, where's the connection? Well, in this upper room, before Jesus, before they eat that Passover meal, that Last Supper, we know Jesus spends a lot of time teaching and talking to his disciples, because this is the last time he's going to see them before he goes to the cross, right? So he spends a lot of time teaching his disciples before he even leaves the upper room. In fact, so much time and so much teaching that we find that in the Gospel of Mark, it's called the Upper Room Discourse. Discourse because he's teaching, upper room because it's in the upper room. And John devotes like 3 or 4 chapters to this discourse. Now, as part of this discourse, as part of this upper room discourse that Jesus gives on this night, one of the things he says to his disciples, and we probably know the verse, "A new commandment I give you, love one another as I have loved you." So within the upper room discourse, in this upper room on Thursday night, Jesus says, "A new commandment I give you, a new mandatum." So since this commandment, this mandatum, was given on Thursday night, that's why it was originally called Maundy Thursday, because Maundy means mandatum, which means commandment. But we know it as Holy Thursday. Whew. Again, now you know why we're spreading this over 2 episodes. At this point, I'm definitely over time. Thank you for hanging in there with me. Next episode is Holy Thursday Part 2. We'll pick up from his arrest, and we'll look at Jesus going through what are called his 3 Jewish trials. We'll look at each of those individually. So with that, I will mercifully wrap up this episode. Thank you for hanging in there. Thank you for supporting this series. Thank you for supporting Fresh Catholic. And until next episode, I'm Charles Merritt. Take care and God bless.